Welcome back. You're watching Network Africa on Channels Television. Police in Egypt have raided the press syndicate in Cairo and arrested two journalists who have been critical of the government. However, the Interior Ministry has denied that officers did storm the Press Labor Union building, a traditional spot in downtown Cairo, to state protests, but confirmed some of its members had arrested the journalists inside the syndicate. Security forces have sought to curb dissent since thousands took to the streets on April 15th to protest the decision by President Abdel Fattah al-Sisi to hand over two islands to Saudi Arabia. Police dispersed smaller protests 2 weeks later. Now, on Sunday, journalists held a sit-in inside the union when officers arrested two of them working for the opposition website, Bawabet Yanaya, including its editor. Let's go now to Edward Uranian with the VOA correspondent in Cairo, who has more on the story. Edward, thank you for joining us.
My pleasure.
What more do we know about what happened on Sunday with the journalists?
Conflicting reports from the journalist syndicate and from the government, the Interior Ministry, and there seems to be a sense that there's a desire to escalate on the side of the journalist syndicate. Some journalists are upset about the breach of their premises, whereas the Interior Minister is saying that there was an arrest warrant out for the two journalists and that they were merely enforcing that arrest warrant. I don't know that the journalist syndicate necessarily has any immunity to it, but traditionally the syndicates like the doctors syndicate, the press syndicate, the lawyers syndicate are not generally breached by security forces. So there is a bit of upset here. And at the same time, to the backdrop, you must understand of an ongoing simmering conflict between the Islamic forces as well as the government and some of the forces that are not Islamic that helped to bring down Hosni Mubarak back in 2011.
Well, this makes me wonder, Edward, what sort of media laws exist in Egypt? Is there really press freedom in the country that you're in?
Well, the new constitution certainly guarantees press freedom. Of course, the Constitution is a bit of a moot point at the moment, where you have, as I said a couple of moments ago, a simmering conflict, low-level conflict in the country. Is there press freedom? Well, I've been in the Middle East for 29 years. I don't feel an oppressive sense of anti-press freedom, and at the same time, I do sense that there's a crackdown, definitely, because the government doesn't want to see more chaos in the streets. And while I'm not going to defend them for their thinking, I'd have to say that you have to weigh both sides at the same time, because if you look at the rest of the Middle East, there is no press freedom and there is chaos. So you have neither one nor the other.
And what was the threat that these journalists could have posed to the government? I mean, it did seem it had something to do with the exchange that went on between the Saudi government and the Egyptian government, when the Saudi king paid that visit a few weeks ago.
Well, they were calling for more protests about the two islands off the Sinai Peninsula that Egypt, the Egyptian president, has offered to give back to Saudi Arabia. I think what stirred emotions on the government side is that people want to create protests in the street. I'm not sure they're so concerned about the reasons behind the protests as the fact that once you get people out in the streets, you get the soccer hooligans out there, people throwing stones, and you re-escalate the situation that has been incrementally calmed down over the months since 2013.
Edward, I'd like to throw this question in. Is there a deliberate attempt by a government to crack down on these protests?
I think they're definitely trying to discourage them. Crack down, well, I mean, they've held a few journalists at police stations for a while until the situation calmed down. eventually letting them go. They've also, detained people who are trying to protest, dispersed them. I don't know that they've made a lot of arrests. That's not the impression I have. But at the same time, yes, they are trying to discourage protests at this point for the reason I said, that they don't want to have an escalation where you have people coming out in the streets and throwing stones, and then having the security forces responding with tear gas and getting into a messy street situation that they were in back in 2013.
Edward, just for the sake of our viewers here, explain to us how important these islands are to Egypt and why it is significant, the Egyptian government gifting it to Saudi Arabia, and why there's so much protest against that move.
Arguably, the islands are important in the sense that they're very close to Sharm el-Sheikh, the major resort town. Arguably, it's a very important diving area. Arguably, there's potentially oil in that region. And the Saudis are planning to build a bridge, which are supposed to go over those islands. So as part of that bridge project, it would seem that the president decided to give those islands back. It's debatable whether those islands belong to one side or the other, although historically they were part of Saudi Arabia before 1950. Are they important? Well, the people who support the government say that those that oppose the government are just looking for a pretext to go out there and protest. That's for your viewers to decide.
Okay, Edward, just one final question. Has the government responded to the arrests of the journalists, apart from what the Interior Ministry is saying, that its officials did not storm that union building? What has the government said about what happened on Sunday?
The government has basically been allowing the Interior Ministry to speak for it, but they have also at the same time loosened restrictions in the area of the press syndicate building, and then maybe retightened them at another point when more protests were called for. It's a bit of a on again, off again thing. It's tough to say what's going on here.
Edward, thank you so much for joining us on Network Africa. Appreciate your reporting on this issue.
My pleasure.
The VOA's Edward Uranian joining us from Cairo. Now, a determined President Uhuru Kenyatta over the weekend set fire to a huge stockpile of ivory, showing his commitment to saving Africa's elephants and stopping the trade in ivory. More than 100 tons of ivory were set ablaze at the Nairobi National Park.
Kenyan officials burning more than 105 tons of ivory and 1.3 tons of rhino horns. Worth over $100 million, the piles of ivory set ablaze at the event send a strong message in the effort to combat the illegal trade that threatens elephant and rhino populations throughout Africa. Kenyan President Uhuru Kenyatta hosted delegates from around the world to support protecting endangered species and combat wildlife crime.
But if we combine it with aggressive enforcement of laws already on our books, with effective control over the movement of ivory, and with other attacks on the incentives to market it, then our elephants will be saved, and this is as simple as that.
Among the many politicians and celebrities on hand to attend the event, United Nations Development Programme UNDP Administrator Helen Clark delivered a keynote address and assisted in lighting one of the many piles of ivory.
Protecting the wildlife is part of the sustainable development of Kenya. Sure, an elephant killed gives a poacher an amount of money, but that is the end of that elephant's story. That elephant alive is worth so much more than it ever was dead.
The estimated tourism value of a living elephant far surpasses that of the ivory contained in its tusks, leading to the strict policies to protect dwindling populations in several countries.
We need a UN wildlife concerted effort. We're all doing a lot. We need to join up our efforts. We need to go to the partners and say, back us as a package. We have the capacity on the ground through the huge field presence of UNDP to scale up very rapidly. We can't see countries losing 50% of their elephants every 5 years and expect to have elephants left. That's how urgent it is.
Earlier this week, Helene Clark had announced that UNDP is beginning to program $60 million of new GEF financing to frontline conservation on the continent.
President Alassane Ouattara says Ivory Coast will break up its long-standing electricity and water monopolies and introduce competition to reduce prices amid growing public concern over price increases. The government decided in June last year to increase electricity prices by 16% over 3 years to keep pace with production costs. Under the arrangement, electricity prices were scheduled to increase by 5% in January, but some customers saw rates rise by as much as 40%, according to a government investigation, prompting President Ouattara to cancel the January increases and call for a more competitive industry. The president now says there is need to open up the water and electricity sectors to competition, which will help lower the price of electricity. The West African nation has emerged from a decade of political turmoil, and civil war was one of the continent's rising stars economically, with growth averaging around 9% for the past 4 years. However, critics of the government complain that most Ivorians have not benefited from the newfound prosperity. Still ahead on Network Africa. A paragliding school in Cairo is taking people to new heights. Stay with us for the uplifting story.